I remember cramming into an old, dented sedan with 3 of my friends, excitement buzzing just under the surface. We didn't have much of a plan, we rarely did, and that made everything feel twice as thrilling. The road leading to the woods was a mess of broken pavement, with weeds creeping through the cracks. My friend Danny kept making jokes about missing campers and strange sightings, trying to set the mood. No one really laughed, but we all pretended it was just for fun. By the time we reached a spot where we thought we could leave the car without worrying about it being towed, the sun was dipping low, bathing the fields around us in a soft, golden light. Rows of tall corn stretched on either side of the narrow path, almost like walls guiding us forward. We slung our backpacks over our shoulders and stepped into the field, the rough leaves brushing against our arms. My eyes flickered from row to row, half expecting someone or something to pop out. Of course, nothing did. Just the occasional gust of wind making the stalks sway in eerie unison. Eventually, the field gave way to the tree line, and we followed a barely visible trail winding through tangled undergrowth and fallen branches. My boots kept snagging on knotted roots, but I pressed on. I was the one who had suggested this trip in the first place, and I didn't want the others to think I was getting cold feet. Behind me, Lindsay swatted at mosquitoes buzzing too close to her face. Every time she flinched, my grip on my backpack's straps tightened. I told myself it was just nerves. After about an hour of trekking, we stumbled into a clearing, just a patch of ground that wasn't as choked by shrubs as the rest of the woods. It felt isolated, perfect for what we wanted. A night away from everything. We dropped our gear, and Danny immediately struggled with the tent poles, muttering curses every time a stake refused to go into the dirt. Meanwhile, I wandered the edges of the clearing, kicking aside dry leaves and peering into the denser part of the forest. Even in daylight, the woods seemed to swallow sound. No birds, no rustling, just an unnatural hush, like the trees were holding their breath. Once the tent was up and we had a small fire going, we sat around watching the daylight drain from the sky. That golden glow faded fast, and the air turned cold. I tried to focus on the crackling flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had noticed us. Danny and Lindsay joked about creepy campfire legends, but our friend Sam barely said a word. She kept scanning the dark tree line, lost in thought. I found myself wishing the night would either hurry up and pass or just show us what was out there. When full darkness settled, the stillness became unnerving. Every tiny sound felt unnaturally close, yet impossible to pinpoint. A rustle in the leaves a few yards away. Silence, a twig snapping. All our heads turned at once, eyes straining against the dim glow of the firelight. I tried to steady my breath, reminding myself that forests were full of wildlife. It was normal to hear movement, but this noise felt calculated, circling us in slow, deliberate arcs. After what felt like hours, my nerves were shot. A flicker of movement behind Danny made me jerk my flashlight up, but when I focused the beam, there was nothing there. That was it. Sam muttered something about leaving, no matter how late it was. No one argued. We stomped out the fire, grabbed our packs, and took off, leaving half our supplies behind. We figured we'd come back in the morning when there was daylight, and maybe a little more courage. As we hurried through the woods, we realized something was off. The way back looked different. The trees seemed unfamiliar, and then the tall corn stalks loomed in front of us. We had taken a wrong turn. The walls of dense stalks scraped against our arms and faces, making every direction feel the same. The ground was soft under our boots, damp and covered in rotting husks. We shouted, partly to keep track of each other, partly to keep whatever was following us at bay. But still, something moved with us, never getting too close, just keeping pace, like it was herding us toward the edge. By the time we stumbled onto a gravel road, my chest was tight. The corn behind us rustled one last time, then fell silent, almost like it was politely letting us go. No one spoke as we marched toward the car. It felt bizarre, how that overwhelming sense of being watched had disappeared so suddenly. Danny started the engine with shaky hands, and the headlights illuminated the entrance to the trail for a brief moment. Nothing but tall, still rows of corn. As if nothing had happened at all. The entire drive home, none of us spoke. I kept replaying every flicker of movement, every sound, trying to convince myself it was just animals, that the woods weren't hiding something else. But deep down, I knew. We had caught the attention of something we shouldn't have, and the worst part was knowing we'd have to go back for our gear. The next morning, Danny banged on my door just after sunrise, determined to retrieve what we left behind. Neither of us could pretend the night hadn't shaken us, but we wanted to act like it hadn't. We rounded up the others and climbed back into the car, telling ourselves that daylight would make everything feel normal. And at first, it did. The morning dew glistened on the grass. Birds sang as if the night before had never happened. We followed the same rough path, stepping over broken twigs and disturbed patches of dirt left from our frantic retreat. Everything seemed smaller, less threatening. Danny tapped a tree trunk with a grin. "Remember this one? Could have sworn it was moving in the dark." We all laughed, even Lindsay, though she was still on edge. Then someone yelled, "Marco!" just to break the tension. It was a dumb joke, but we all chuckled. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, a voice answered, "Polo." We froze. It wasn't close, but something about it felt wrong. Danny, trying to be brave, called out again, "Marco!" Again, the voice responded, "Polo." There was something off about the way it echoed, too calm, too distant. And yet, we couldn't help ourselves. We followed it. Step by step, we moved deeper than we had the night before. The sunlight filtering through the trees thinned, casting long, stretched-out shadows. Even the birds had gone quiet. We came to an old, rusted barbed wire fence, almost swallowed by vines. Beyond it, the crumbling remains of a structure stood, just weathered stone and collapsed wood. It looked ancient, abandoned for longer than we could guess. We had seen plenty of empty farmhouses and barns in our time, but this place felt wrong. The ground was scattered with broken glass and splintered beams. The fence posts bore deep gouges, as if something with claws had torn at them. And then the voice stopped. We hesitated, scanning the ruins, expecting to see someone duck behind a wall. Nothing moved. My skin crawled. Something about this place was watching us, waiting. Lindsay called out one last time, "Marco!" Silence. None of us wanted to stay any longer. The tents were nowhere in sight, and honestly, none of us cared anymore. We turned back, feeling the heavy quiet press around us. Every step away felt like a dare, like something was just waiting for us to look back. When we finally reached the trailhead, the sun felt warmer. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. As we reached the car, I stole one last glance over my shoulder. A blur, maybe a figure, maybe just shifting leaves. Hard to say. Either way, I wasn't about to stick around to find out. We left, and we never went back. Some things, it turns out, are better left alone. I woke up earlier than necessary, buzzing with anticipation for the day ahead. We loaded into the car, my husband in the passenger seat, and our dog happily nestled in the back, her nose pressed against the window as if she couldn't wait to get on the trail. When we arrived at the parking lot, the morning light was still soft, filtering through the trees in a way that made everything seem fresh and full of promise. I'd heard stories about this waterfall for years, how people gathered to take pictures and wade in the pool below. I usually preferred quieter spots, but as we started walking, I found myself enjoying the murmur of fellow hikers, the sound of children running ahead, couples chatting, and the occasional clatter of water bottles in backpacks. It all felt like a lively outdoor gathering. The trail leading to the waterfall was well-worn and broad. Our dog led the way, ears perked and tail wagging so hard I thought she might lift off the ground. Every so often, she would stop to investigate an interesting rock or patch of moss. I chuckled when she had a small standoff with a squirrel that chattered at her from a low-hanging branch. When we finally reached the waterfall, the sight looked like something from a postcard. The sunlight hit the mist just right, creating a faint rainbow where the water crashed into the pool below. Families splashed around, unfazed by the chill, and the air was alive with excited voices. My husband suggested we take a quick break and dip our feet in, but I felt an urge to explore further. Something about venturing beyond the busy area seemed appealing. I wanted to find a quiet piece of the forest away from the noise. We started up a narrow path that wound around the waterfall, leaving the others behind. It was a bit of a scramble, and we had to watch our footing on the damp rocks. My husband joked about how each step took us further from cell service. At one point, we paused on a ledge overlooking the falls. The people below looked so tiny, their voices reduced to faint echoes that barely reached us. Ahead, the trail dipped into a denser section of forest. The canopy thickened, allowing only slivers of sunlight to flicker onto the path. It grew quieter, too. I remember noticing how the sound of the waterfall faded until the most prominent noises were our dogs panting and the crunch of our boots. I glanced at my husband. He was taking in the scenery, looking a little wary but still eager for adventure. Something about that transition, from the cheerful chatter by the waterfall to the stillness under the towering trees, made me strangely alert. Not exactly scared, but suddenly aware of every root and branch around us. The air felt different, too, cooler, a little heavier. Our dog, completely oblivious to my unease, trotted forward, her nose following scents only she could detect. I told myself we'd hiked countless times before with no issues, but as the path narrowed and shadows deepened around us, I couldn't ignore the subtle unease creeping into my mind. My husband gave me a look that suggested he felt it too, though neither of us spoke about it. The plan was to enjoy a quiet walk, and for the most part, we still were. The trees stood tall, their trunks damp from recent rain. We pressed on, drawn by the idea of finding a secluded viewpoint or maybe even a hidden pool to call our own. But with each step, we moved further from the familiar sounds of the waterfall, further from the safety of the crowd. At some point, my husband asked if I could hear any birds. That's when we both realized they had either gone silent or we had left them behind. The hush in the forest felt deliberate, like the entire place was keeping a secret. Even then, our dog remained as energetic as ever, bounding ahead with no hesitation. We didn't have the heart to turn around, not yet. The day was still open in front of us. Besides, I kept telling myself there was no real reason to be uneasy. Eventually, we found ourselves on a slight incline, the trail winding through thick tree trunks. We were well beyond sight of anyone else. I paused to catch my breath, glancing back to make sure we hadn't lost our bearings. My husband placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression hovering between excitement and concern. Our dog barked once, a single sharp sound that echoed more than it should have. Then she went back to sniffing around, her tail wagging. I thought we were alone, free to discover a quiet corner of the woods untouched by crowds. What I didn't realize was that untouched doesn't always mean safe. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the forest shifted from peaceful to unsettling, but it happened fast. 1 second, our dog was happily padding along, tail wagging. The next, she froze, her leash yanked in my hand so abruptly that I nearly stumbled. I stopped short, scanning the trees for movement. My husband stood a few steps behind me, breathing heavier now, and the only sound I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. The path ahead looked ordinary, just more tangled roots and thick foliage. But our dog's posture was unmistakable. Her legs were stiff, her ears pinned back, and a quiet whimper escaped her throat. She refused to move forward, pulling against the leash so forcefully that I worried she might slip out of her collar. I whispered her name, coaxing her gently, but she only took a hesitant step backward, eyes locked on something ahead. My husband moved closer, his voice low. We exchanged a look that said, "This isn't normal. This isn't just a stubborn dog. Something's wrong." Time felt strange, stretched out, as we hesitated there. The silence pressed down on us. I strained to hear anything. A twig snapping, underbrush shifting, but there was nothing. No rustling of small animals, no distant chatter of birds. It was the total absence of noise that unsettled me the most. Our dog let out a shaky whine, actively pulling us back the way we had come. She had never acted this way before. Usually, she was the one eager to lead us deeper into the woods. My husband murmured that we should turn back, and I didn't argue. A part of me wanted to look just once to confirm if something or someone was out there. But my curiosity couldn't stand against the look in my dog's eyes. She was terrified, and the longer we stood there, the more I felt a quiet panic creeping in. We had no way of knowing what lay ahead, but the forest had shifted into something unfamiliar, something that no longer felt welcoming. I nodded to my husband, and we both turned around, careful not to move too fast. Our dog practically dragged us downhill, as if she trusted only the path behind us. My pulse pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every step away felt like slipping out of reach of something we had no business encountering. Minutes later, the distant roar of the waterfall came back into focus. Relief mingled with lingering unease as we spotted other hikers. A group of teenagers chatting, a family unfolding picnic blankets. The normal world was just ahead, only a short distance from where we had been. Yet, as we made our way back to the parking lot, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching us from the trees. Our dog, finally at ease, trotted along as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. We wouldn't be hiking that section again. Some places, once touched by an unexplained fear, never quite feel the same. I had been slouched in my rickety office chair, counting the minutes until the midday heat eased up, when the radio crackled on my desk. One of our volunteers was on the other end, their voice unsteady as they requested immediate backup. They'd spotted smoke rising near the far edge of our small desert reserve. Usually, suspicious plumes of smoke meant another abandoned car set alight, a sight we encountered so often it barely fazed me anymore. But something in the volunteers' shaky tone gnawed at me. This time, something felt different. Without waiting for protocol or checking the sign-out sheet, I grabbed my keys and motioned for my coworker, Luis, to follow. We jumped into our dust-coated truck and sped down the desolate road, the heat shimmering in waves ahead of us. My mind played out the worst possibilities. A wildfire raging out of control, someone trapped inside a burned-out vehicle, or something even worse that I couldn't quite put into words. The desert felt unnervingly still. Normally, I'd catch sight of jackrabbits darting across the road or a hawk circling above, but not this time. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath, bracing for bad news. Luis fiddled with the radio, trying to reach the volunteers again, but all we got was static laced with faint crackles. Each burst of white noise made me grip the steering wheel harder. As we rounded a bend, we finally saw it, thick smoke curling into the sky, carrying the acrid stench of burning rubber and scorched metal. We pulled up, tires crunching over gravel, and the volunteers waved us over, their faces drained of all color. Stepping out, I was hit by a wave of heat so intense it felt like opening an oven door. The car, or what remained of it, was little more than a charred metal husk. The flames had mostly died down, leaving behind only thick, angry fumes. Luis and I exchanged uneasy glances. We'd seen torched vehicles before, usually stolen ones stripped for parts and discarded. But as we moved closer, something caught my eye through the shattered driver's side window. A shape slumped forward over the wheel. I tried to convince myself it was just melted upholstery. Stepping around for a clearer view, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a ruined seat. It was a body. The remains were blackened and twisted, features unrecognizable. The door handle had melted in places and rope, yes, rope, had fused into the metal. This wasn't some joyride gone wrong. Someone had brought this car here, tied the victim inside, shot them, and then set the whole thing ablaze. A cold, suffocating weight settled on me, as if the desert itself had turned hostile. Luis rushed back to the truck to call for proper backup. As we waited, the thick smoke coiled into the sky, the stench clinging to my clothes. Time slowed to a crawl. One of the volunteers stood nearby, stammering about how they'd initially assumed it was just another stripped car, until they peered inside. I scanned the surrounding desert, suddenly paranoid that whoever had done this was still nearby, watching us from the scrub. Maybe from behind a tumbleweed. The fire department eventually arrived, dousing the smoldering wreck and sending up fresh plumes of steam. Then came the police, taping off the area with familiar yellow caution tape. I focused on the small details, half-buried food wrappers in the sand, bullet holes pocking the metal frame. How many shots had been fired? Had the victim been alive when they were tied up? I hated how my mind drifted into such morbid territory, but I needed to process the facts if I ever wanted to sleep again. Hours passed as investigators combed through the remains, taking photos, bagging bits of rope and metal. I caught Luis standing off to the side, staring at the wreckage in silence. He'd once told me he'd seen plenty of gore in a past job, but even he looked shaken. This wasn't just violence, it was cruelty. Eventually, the authorities declared the site secure and sent us on our way. A few sheriff's deputies stayed behind to guard the perimeter for forensic teams. As Luis and I drove back, the sky bled into deep, sunburned orange. My head swam with everything we'd seen. The volunteers followed in their own car, still rattled from the realization that what they'd stumbled upon was far worse than they'd first assumed. By the time we reached the station, the rumors had already started. Word spreads fast in small communities, and people love a ghost story. I overheard someone joking that it would probably become the reserve's newest attraction. Visitors love a chilling legend, but there was nothing amusing about the images stuck in my head. The twisted rope, the scorched seat, the unrecognizable form in the driver's seat. I tried distracting myself with small tasks, sorting equipment, scribbling nonsense notes about my next shift. Nothing helped. I knew I wouldn't be able to forget what I had seen. The desert had always been harsh, but I had never imagined it could be so merciless. And we still had no idea who that person was or why they had ended up alone on that isolated stretch of sand. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the stench of burned metal and flesh, the hushed voices of onlookers too shaken to speak. My thoughts circled the same grim idea: whoever had done this could do it again if they wanted to. For the first time since I took this job, the open desert no longer felt like a place of freedom. It felt like a place where secrets were buried, never meant to be uncovered. The next call came sooner than I expected, sending the entire station into a near panic. Our supervisor, normally the picture of calm, was on the phone, voice tense. A man had called in, threatening to end it all. He claimed to have a stash of weapons. He rattled off coordinates that placed him right on the outskirts of our jurisdiction. I stood in the office, radio in hand, waiting to be dispatched, my mind already racing toward worst-case scenarios. Would we find another horrific scene like the burned-out car? We had no choice but to go. Protocol demanded it, no matter how unqualified we felt for handling a crisis involving a potentially armed man. My coworker, Jake, and I climbed into the same dust-covered truck and sped toward the location. The sun glared down, bleaching the landscape into a pale, lifeless expanse. By the time we arrived, another agency had already reached the scene. One of their rangers stood beside a truck, raising a hand to signal us to stay back. We eased off the gas and came to a halt, the air around us thick with tension. The lead ranger, a woman who looked utterly exhausted, approached us, her expression grim. She spoke in a hushed tone. The man had followed through with his threat, but he hadn't gone quickly. He had shot himself and then wandered for some distance before finally collapsing. That knowledge hit me like a weight on my chest. While Jake stayed back with the truck, I stepped forward, stopping where the sand turned darker. Another ranger was kneeling nearby, radio in hand, shaking his head. I couldn't see the body. It was hidden behind the rocks, but the silence from everyone around me told me I didn't want to. As we left the scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that these desert reserves, places I once loved, had turned into something else entirely. The further we drove, the more the landscape seemed to glare down at us, as if the desert itself was exhausted by witnessing so much despair. Even beneath a sky full of stars, the feeling lingered. The desert was vast, unbothered by human tragedy, and yet I was the one haunted by it. I drove out to the woods near the end of October, hoping to enjoy one last quiet weekend before the cold truly set in. The spot I picked wasn't anything remarkable on a map, just a small clearing I had come across the year before. It was cozy, enclosed by towering trees whose leaves were just beginning to change into deep shades of amber and crimson. I remember thinking how breathtaking everything looked under the soft autumn sun. It had a calming effect that only nature can bring. The first afternoon went smoothly. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and listened to the distant calls of birds I couldn't name. The air was cool but not biting, and my meal by the fire felt like a luxury. As night fell, nothing seemed unusual. The typical sounds of the nighttime forest lulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep. But the next morning, something felt different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. I woke up to the sun filtering through the branches, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Then, I noticed how tense I was. My eyes kept flicking from the coffee I was making back toward the trees, as if I expected to catch sight of something or someone watching me. I had no real reason to feel uneasy, yet every movement felt deliberate and weighted. After breakfast, I found myself wandering into the trees. I hadn't planned on hiking, but there was this strange pull, like the forest itself was guiding me in. That's the best way I can explain it. I didn't decide to take a walk. My legs just carried me forward. The deeper I went, the more I realized I didn't recognize the landscape. The trees and undergrowth didn't look like anywhere I had been before. Then, I saw something that sent a chill through me. A smooth, rectangular slab lying flat on the ground. It had a glossy surface, reflecting the muted sunlight, yet despite the thick layer of fallen leaves around it, the slab itself was spotless. Not a single scratch, no moss or dirt. When you spend a lot of time outdoors, you get used to how quickly nature reclaims things. So how had this thing remained untouched? Something inside me screamed that I should turn around, but curiosity got the best of me. I stepped closer, carefully avoiding the dry twigs beneath my feet. The slab reminded me of a gravestone that had toppled over, only there were no markings, no inscriptions, nothing to indicate why it was there. It didn't belong. This wasn't a known trail, and I hadn't seen another person for miles. As I stood there, a strange heaviness crept over me, like I had stepped into a place that didn't want me there. My tent was only about 30 feet away, yet I felt disoriented, as if I had wandered far beyond where I should be. I forced myself to glance back, and there it was, my bright red tent, still visible. I wasn't lost, not physically, but every part of me felt disconnected, unmoored. Then it happened. A gust of air, colder than anything I'd felt that season, rushed past me. It knocked the breath from my lungs, yet the trees remained perfectly still. The leaves on the ground didn't move. Before I could make sense of it, a deafening crack shattered the silence. It was one singular, earth-shaking noise, reverberating in every direction. My ears rang, and when the sound faded, I looked up, only to realize it was no longer early afternoon. The sun had dipped low, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Just moments ago, it had been maybe 3 in the afternoon. Now it was nearly evening. Hours had slipped away without me noticing, and the slab was gone. In its place was nothing but undisturbed earth covered in leaves. That was all it took to snap me out of my trance. Every step back to my tent felt suffocating, as if something unseen was closing in. Yet when I turned, I saw nothing. I reached my tent and fumbled for my flashlight, even though there was still some light left. I knew I couldn't safely hike back to my car in the dark, not in my current state of mind, so I told myself I'd wait until morning, no matter how terrifying the night might be. And terrifying doesn't even begin to describe it. I huddled in my tent, repeating in my head that I just needed to make it until sunrise. I tried to stay calm, but my nerves were shot. Outside, the silence was suffocating. No rustling leaves, no distant chirping, just absolute stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I flicked my flashlight on and off a few times, making sure it worked. The thought of being left in complete darkness sent a wave of panic through me. Each flicker of the beam sent twisted shadows dancing against the tent walls. Normally, the soft glow of a flashlight feels comforting inside a tent. That night, it felt like a signal, a beacon to whatever was out there. Minutes dragged by, Then I heard it, a low, rumbling noise, drifting in from beyond the thin fabric walls. At first, I thought it might be distant thunder, but the sound had a rhythmic quality, like breathing. Slow, deep exhales. It reminded me of someone snoring. I held my breath, straining to listen, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, steady and rasping. Worse, it wasn't coming from just one direction. 1 second, it was to my left. The next, directly behind me. That meant whatever was making the noise was moving, circling me. I've camped enough to know how animals sound. They make noise, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. But this, it was silent, except for that awful rhythmic breathing. It wasn't just standing still. It was hovering, drifting. I clutched my flashlight, but it felt useless. What was I going to do? Shine a light at something I couldn't see? The night stretched on, endless and excruciating. My body begged for rest, but every time I closed my eyes, the breathing would shift, snapping me awake. I was paralyzed, caught in a waiting game with something I couldn't see. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. Completely. 1 second it was there, the next gone. That silence was almost worse. As soon as the first hint of daylight crept through the trees, I packed up with shaking hands, stuffing my gear in my bag without care. The forest was still eerily quiet. The usual morning sounds, birds, insects, the wind, were missing. Every step on the trail felt like a trespass, like I was in a place I was never meant to be. The trees that had once looked beautiful now loomed over me, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. I didn't feel safe until I reached the dirt road leading back to my car. Only then did I glance back, half expecting to see that glossy slab again. But there was nothing, just still, waiting trees. Even after driving miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. That night, and many nights after, I woke with a start. Sure, I heard that same low, rattling breath in the dark corners of my room. The logical part of me tried to dismiss it all as exhaustion or a bad dream. But deep down, I knew. I had found something in those woods. Something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. And it wasn't done with me yet. I pulled my dusty truck off the highway into Red Gorge National Park. My plan as straightforward as could be. Snap a few scenic shots of the towering cliffs, maybe find some animal tracks to photograph, then settle in for the night. Looking back, it almost felt naive. You'd think after years of leading outdoor expeditions, I'd be ready for anything. But as I eased my vehicle into the uneven gravel lot near the trailhead, an eerie stillness pressed in on me like the weight of the dry heat. It was that specific kind of hush you only get in the wilderness, the kind that makes you question your own breath. Stepping out, I spotted a weathered wooden sign marking the start of the trail. Ahead, the canyon walls stretched high, their dark silhouettes etched against the late afternoon sky. The sun, hanging low, cast long twisting shadows across the rocky ground. A park ranger's SUV had rolled past me earlier, the ranger mentioning something about strange wildlife activity in the area. At the time, I shrugged it off. Sometimes they just like to keep visitors on their toes. Still, something felt off. I took a swig from my water jug, trying to shake the unease rattling around in my thoughts. A few hundred yards from my truck, the trail was barely more than a scattering of stones and dry brush, occasionally speckled with bursts of wildflowers clinging to life in the parched soil. This part of the park was notorious for the river's unpredictable shifts. Lately, I'd heard murmurs of drought and irrigation issues, so I wondered how deep the water would actually be. The moment my truck was out of sight, it felt like the land had turned its attention toward me. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been, my boots scraping against loose gravel, sending small echoes into the quiet. More than once, I turned my head, convinced I wasn't alone. But each time, nothing was there. Telling myself it was just nerves did little to ease the tightness creeping into my chest. As I neared the mouth of the canyon, its sheer size swallowed my concerns for a moment. The ancient rock layers stacked upon one another, time carved into every jagged edge. The sunlight caught in the crevices, illuminating drifting specks of dust. I was here to capture that beauty, to bring back something for my presentation. But standing there, I couldn't shake the strange mix of awe and unease twisting in my gut. I was lining up my first shot when a flicker of movement across the river froze me in place. At first, it looked like something dragging itself through the dirt, something lying on its side but still pushing forward. My mind scrambled to fit it into something recognizable, but nothing made sense. I stepped closer for a better view. Then I saw it, a mountain lion. Not just any mountain lion, this one was massive, bigger than any I'd seen in the wild before. Its fur had a muted hue, almost the color of a deer's hide, which was probably why I hadn't recognized it at first. It moved with eerie grace, every step smooth, effortless, as though gravity barely held it down. My breath caught in my throat. I'd heard stories about big cats in this area, but reading about them was nothing like seeing one up close. It was locked onto something behind a thicket of brush. A rabbit, maybe a small deer, or possibly something I couldn't see. For a moment, I was mesmerized, watching the silent, fluid way it moved. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me. My stomach twisted into a knot. I had never fully grasped what people meant by a predator's gaze until that moment. Its eyes caught the last glint of sunlight, sharp and calculating, as if it were sizing me up, deciding whether I was worth the trouble. A shallow river lay between us, but it wouldn't take much for the cat to cross if it really wanted to. I didn't know if I should hold its stare or look away. Some distant part of my brain warned that running might trigger something I didn't want to test. So I stayed put, camera gripped in trembling hands, primal fear settling into my bones. The cat's ears twitched. It glanced back at whatever it had been stalking, then returned its attention to me. The seconds stretched thin. Would it charge? Would it cross the river? My pulse pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I readied myself to run, but before I could, the lion let out a slow exhale, then turned away like I wasn't worth the effort. I barely managed to hold in a gasp of relief. Hands shaking, I inched backward before finally turning and walking, quickly but carefully, back toward my truck, glancing over my shoulder with every step. I half expected to see a shadow bounding after me, but all I was met with was the heavy silence of the desert. By the time I reached the truck, my whole body buzzed from adrenaline. The sun had nearly vanished, bleeding deep reds and oranges across the sky. Beautiful, if not for the lingering dread twisting in my gut. Leaning against the vehicle, I took another long drink of water, trying to steady myself. Part of me wanted to leave right then, but another part stubbornly clung to the reason I'd come. This was a place for wild, unpredictable experiences, but there was a difference between seeking adventure and flirting with danger. The night settled in fast as I drove toward the nearest campsite. A ranger had mentioned it wasn't far, just a dirt pull-off with a fire ring and a pit toilet, the usual no-frills setup. The deeper the sky darkened, the more the desert transformed into a shifting, uncertain landscape where every boulder and bush took on unfamiliar shapes. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting those glowing eyes to reappear. When I finally reached the site, there was only one other car. A tiny sedan with its tent zipped up tight. No movement. That left me alone with my thoughts. As I stepped onto the rocky ground, flashlight in hand, the branches of a gnarled mesquite tree scraped together in the wind, making a dry whisper that sent a shiver up my spine. I sat in the truck, eating a few stale cookies, trying to push away the tension still coiled in my chest. Then I heard it, a distant, rasping scream echoing through the canyon. I froze. I had read about that sound before, the chilling, guttural cry of a mountain lion, a noise somewhere between a wail and a shriek. Hearing it in the dead of night, knowing a massive cat was nearby, made my stomach twist. I tried to convince myself it was miles away, that the rocky terrain distorted sound. But deep down, I couldn't shake the memory of those golden eyes, watching, assessing. I didn't sleep much that night. Every gust of wind sent my imagination spiraling. Every shadow outside seemed alive. And in the early hours before dawn, when the wind died down and the desert lay still, I swore I heard soft footsteps circling my truck. By morning, everything looked different, smaller, safer. But as I packed up my gear and prepared to leave, I glanced toward the rocks, where faint impressions in the dust hinted at something that had passed through in the night. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. The wild doesn't forget you, especially once you've caught its attention.